let's get started. Let's get started. So thank you, Nicole. It's always fun to co-host from the Ground Up series with you. Tonight's our 8th, if you will. My name is Maria Fortes, and I am the director of the Practice Heroes. On tonight's From the Ground Up, we have amazing guests joining us tonight from Abyde, and I'm going to have them, Chris and Amber, who's going to dispel the myth of HIPAA compliance for your practice and patients. And remember, each time we have From the Ground Up, our goal today or tonight is that you will come away with an understanding, knowledge, and pearls of wisdom, if you will, that you can apply to be more successful in your business. So in tonight's presentations, we're going to open it up for questions towards the end.
Yeah.
Would be agreed upon, right? You can also enter your questions into the chat box below. And I think we should just go ahead and start. And so sounds good. So great. And without further ado, thanks, Penny. By the way, it's nice to see you as well. Yay, Penny. Alpha Dental. All right. And then don't forget to stick with us towards the end to get the code for your $25 Grubhub. And without further ado, I would love to introduce to you, we have Amber Holden and Chris Wheaton from Abyde.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. My name is Amber Holden. I'm a customer success specialist here at Abyde. And I have my colleague Chris here as well. I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, nice to meet you all. Thanks for having us. We appreciate the opportunity to simplify HIPAA tonight. I know it's not the most exciting topic, but I promise we'll do our best to do it in a very convenient and fast way. That we really want the idea for you guys to come out of this to just have HIPAA as an approachable topic, something that you guys can understand. It's not a barrier law, it's a permissive law. So just really appreciate that opportunity. Abyde, real quick, and Amber will go into this in a second. We're a technology company in Tampa, and all we do all day, every day is educate independent practices just like you. So we're really excited about the opportunity tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, super, super excited. Let's go ahead and get started. Alrighty. Well, again, my name is Amber Holden, and I'm a customer success specialist here at Abyde. Again, super excited to be with you guys today. But I will tell you a little bit more about who we are here at Abyde as we go forward. But I just wanted to highlight a couple things that Abyde is focused on exceptional education and HIPAA resources. And if you guys have any questions regarding HIPAA in general or the content we're going to cover today, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to help. But we appreciate you carving out some time and joining us this afternoon or maybe midday, wherever you're coming from. But as you can see by the title of the webinar, today we're going to be simplifying HIPAA compliance for you and your practice. Now, to get us going today, I have a little bit of a rhetorical question, but do have a question for everyone. What does the HIPAA acronym actually stand for? Now, the reason we start with these is because a lot of practices, about 95% of practices that we educate, can't tell us what it means, but the correct answer for the question today is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. Now, this is an acronym that doesn't really have anything to do with your roles and responsibilities as a practice at all. And it's actually a great example about how confusing HIPAA can actually be. The acronym does not provide any insight of what must be accomplished to comply with these regulations. But really, when it comes down to it, what those regulations include is just a lot of legalese. And I definitely don't plan on giving you guys a boring history lesson today, but I just want to point to two takeaways in HIPAA's history. So the first one is that HIPAA has actually been around for quite some time now, since 1996, and enforcement has finally caught up with these regulations from 2013 onward, which is where you'll see some pretty hefty fines we'll touch on a little bit later come into play. And then the second is that in December of 2020, the HHS released new proposed changes to the HIPAA privacy rule, and these aren't finalized just yet, but it does go to show that, HIPAA isn't some old regulation that no one really cares about. It is an active and changing thing that the government has set its sights on beefing up enforcement around. Now, just to take a quick step back and tell you just briefly about who we are here at Abyde and just where we come in and all this. So we are a technology company, as Chris said, based out of sunny Tampa, Florida. And we're the industry leaders when it comes to HIPAA compliance, and we provide education and solutions specifically for the independent dental industry. So this is one of the many reasons why CareStack is so excited about us just educating you today. So on that note, we're going to go ahead and get into the agenda of today's webinar. Now, just as I mentioned, education is our top priority here at Abyde. So this is just our agenda of what we're going to be going over this afternoon. So first, we're going to go over the state of HIPAA compliance and enforcement examples, just touching on the most recent trends and released HIPAA audit data. We'll then go over where you guys stand and really what takeaways your practice needs to have as you plan for the rest of 2022. And then we'll also lay out the steps involved to becoming HIPAA compliant. So if you understand what the privacy and the security rules require your practice to accomplish, then you'll have a pretty good idea of what that HIPAA compliance action plan should look like for you in your practice. So first off, what does HIPAA enforcement look like today, and really why does your practice need to care? So we just covered that HIPAA has been around for 26 years now. So why all of a sudden is it coming to the forefront? Well, there are a lot of reasons enforcement has seen a massive uptick in recent years, with the most impactful being just public awareness of the provider's HIPAA responsibilities that has resulted in rising of patient complaints, the rapid implementation of technology in healthcare, which leads to a record amount of breaches, unfortunately, and last but certainly not least, the government's ongoing proactive HIPAA audit program. So each of these are what we like to think of as investigation triggers, just meaning the reasons the government could come knocking on your door, and the data just goes to show it's not really a matter of if, but when a practice could potentially go through a HIPAA investigation. Now, as you can see here, patient complaints are increasing dramatically, and trust me, this is definitely not something you want to see an exponential curve on, but unfortunately, the data is only going up and up. Over the last couple of years, there has been an increased focus on HIPAA compliance around sharing coronavirus data, in addition to emphasis on patient rights to their own records. And this has drastically contributed to patient complaints. I know our support team and us specifically, we have seen a huge number of calls that we've received from disgruntled patients who Google HIPAA and they come across Abyde as an industry leader, but they want to, file a complaint to us, but we have to, obviously tell them to reach out to the OCR directly. That's just a prime example of how confusing things can be, but obviously how the public is more educated than ever on a provider's responsibility to keep protected health information secure. So why these numbers matter to you is that just a single complaint, even if totally unfounded, can lead to a full-scale HIPAA investigation. We'll discuss in a little bit what pieces you need to have in place to pass a HIPAA audit, as well as identify what types of penalties you can expect if audited and you don't pass. So on this graph, you can see that there is a trend, unfortunately. So it's not fleeting. It is becoming more mainstream. And over the last 6 years, when proactive audits actually started, you can see that there's been an increase in fines. And I think we can all appreciate if the government drills and they find oil, obviously, what are they going to keep doing, right? So the same thing here, especially if they feel like they're doing the right thing by holding medical practices accountable, just in securing protected health information. Now, diving a little bit deeper into the fines, this is actually a breakdown of just 2021 fines. And as you can see, almost 85% of last year's fines were related to one specific area, which were cyber attacks or cyber-related breaches. But please note that these fines were not levied because the practice was just unlucky. They were fined because the breach acted as a trigger point for a full-scale HIPAA investigation, and the OCR found systematic noncompliance, as they put it, in every single instance. Second biggest piece here of fines was related to patient right of access, where practices failed to provide patients just with their own records upon request, and the patients complained to the OCR as a result. So what this tells us, and I hope you guys too, is that these triggers for these investigations were in most cases outside of the practice's control, but it still led them to a whopping number of breaches and fines because they didn't have those HIPAA basics in place.
Okay, I have a question for you guys then.
Sure.
And maybe I should know something like this being in the industry, but how likely is it that an independent practice would be investigated and fined? Do you have like any statistics or studies on that?
Yeah, appreciate that. I'll take that. It's honestly hard to say because it's kind of like we always compare it to not wearing a seatbelt or speeding, right? Like we really have to think about this as like, it's only until you get caught, and the government has limited resources in the sense that they're going to react to some type of data breach or patient complaint, which no practice is immune to. So really the point of this is, and I'm going to actually share this OCR portal within the chat feature right now, is that, again, you're not immune to a data breach or a patient complaint at this point in your practice's life, right? This portal shows about over 800 active investigations. And something to keep in mind here is that these investigations are only for 500 patients and above, right? The amount of data breaches that are 500 and below that you still need to report within the year we have no idea what those numbers are, right? So the government really only releases data retro, from years prior, and these audits take years and years. And I know on the federal side, we've passed audits that have taken a year and a half. So just, the idea is really to have an action plan in place and be proactive, because if and when you do have a breach or complaint, just have the documentation ready, which Amber's going to go over here in a second.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
I'm happy I asked now.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. All right, so the next slide here, HIPAA breaks down enforcement and fines into 4 separate levels. So as you go up in severity, the maximum fine amount increases significantly. I'm not going to spend too much time here other than just to highlight the minimum fine we've ever seen was about $3,500. So we're not really talking about, a couple $100 fines here. These can be extremely damaging to any size organization, but the max fine that we've seen is sitting at $1.8 million for a single violation.
I can do a lot with $1.8 million.
Yes.
Oh, yes, me too. Shopping sprees all the way.
Yeah.
Amber, you better be taking me on one then.
I gotcha. But off to some good news, enough of the bad fine news and all that. But this is great news for practices. Just this last year, the government has taken a huge step to incentivize covered entities to protect themselves from HIPAA fines. So it may not sound like earth-shattering information by any means, but under the HIPAA Safe Harbor law, the government has enacted the bipartisan bill to encourage covered entities to implement HIPAA standards that meet federal and state laws. This is really just stating that there's going to be reduced penalties for those who are compliant should there ever be a HIPAA incident like a data breach or a patient complaint. Now, there's also a brand new amendment to the HITECH Act as well, which governs healthcare information technology. This was passed January 5th of 2021. This amendment also incentivizes practices who achieve basic security measures, particularly, unfortunately, with the growing cyber threats that we face today. But it requires practices to comply with the HIPAA security rule and implement appropriate technical safeguards just for any vulnerabilities that they've identified in their security risk analysis. So great news here. If your practice can show compliance with these aspects for at least 12 months prior to any HIPAA incident, like a data breach, a patient complaint, or a proactive audit, then the Office of Civil Rights will reduce fines, cut short any HIPAA audits, or reduce the corrective action plan that they give you, maybe all 3, which would be awesome, that your practice may have otherwise received. So that's really, really great news. And now with all that being said, you're probably wondering just where you stand in comparison to the Safe Harbor law. If you are, I have even more good news for you. We're going to actually take the next 2 minutes or so and go through a HIPAA challenge. You can see your grade or your compliance program or what it would earn against a government audit. So this is probably the only presentation where someone's going to tell you to take out your phone. You can go ahead and scan the QR code here with your camera app. If you want to use the computer's web browser, you're more than welcome to do so too, if that's a little easier. But you can just type in the URL that you see below the code. It's going to take you directly to the challenge. So this should just take a couple minutes. If you're unable to do it on here, we can put it in the chat and you can copy and paste it to complete later if that works. But this is just going to address all the major areas of your basic HIPAA program, just so you can get the most out of the next few slides as well. Super, super beneficial. So we're just going to pause here just for a few minutes, let everyone open that up and go through some questions.
Chris, I hope you came with the dad jokes to fill the time.
I have
I wish
so
I
many.
had some. He's a brand new dad, so he might have some.
Congratulations. Okay, so I'm glad that one stuck. All right. Hit us with your best dad joke.
I was like, how'd you know I was a dad?
Talk to you on
Is it
LinkedIn.
Yeah, there you go. And to Amber's point, this is a very quick way to grade your practice. It's only between you and us, but it's a dynamically generated PDF of where you stand. So it's going to ask you 10 to 15 questions, and then ultimately you'll have an action plan and kind of a takeaway. So if you have any questions on that, we're happy to help. The link is in the chat.
Right. I think this is a great tool to have because some people may not know where they stand. Coming from, working in a practice myself, you've got a lot of questions and areas of concern. And I think this is great that you have this to offer to our audience tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if some of the questions don't make sense to you, I promise you're not alone. If you answer some questions and you realize that your HIPAA program may not be where you would like it to be, again, you're not alone. We definitely know that there's just a lot of practices out there who are just not educated correctly. So that's just why we're here today, to educate you guys and just hope you get a good action plan going forward if you're not in the space that you would like to be. So I'll give you guys just another minute. And if you're not finished by the time we move on, of course, we have it in the chat and you can finish it after the webinar or maybe even tomorrow whenever you have some time. Alrighty, so I'll go ahead and keep it moving here. Again, if you guys have questions on that, please feel free to use the chat. But a great place for us to start is just defining HIPAA compliance. Abyde, we know from experience that to pass a HIPAA audit, it's vital your practice can provide documented proof that there's a culture of compliance within your organization. Now, this is a culture of compliance that just weaves itself in and out of every aspect of your practice. Culture of security will protect your patient's information, but the documentation is going to protect your practice. At Abyde, we've worked with thousands and thousands of practices just across the country. We understand that the documentation piece often falls between the cracks a bit, just mainly because it's a little confusing to know what documentation you should be pulling together in the first place. But we see so many times that HIPAA compliance being the responsibility of staff member who's already wearing many different hats or working at max capacity. Without being properly educated, most organizations don't even know where to start, and they don't necessarily have the time to go and do the research either. So we've seen many audit results with independent dental practices, and it's becoming a little bit, more vulnerable to HIPAA fines. Those are just increasing significantly just due to the minimal guidance for office managers, administrators, and even doctors. So that's why we hope this webinar is seen as valuable by you guys today, and we take pride in our education. So as I go through the next few slides, we're just going to give you a little bit of an idea of what documentation should look like, specifically what you'll need to provide in case of a HIPAA compliance investigation. But before we go through the slides, I want you guys to think of HIPAA like taxes. Some people may be doing their taxes now, I hope, maybe not, but we all know you can pay your taxes accordingly each year, but if you don't have that correct documentation to show the IRS in case of an audit, it's like you never did. So same situation here when it comes to HIPAA. A practice can have a culture of compliance in place, but without having proper documentation, the government will not consider that practice compliant. So this is precisely the reason the government sees such a lack of compliance. There's typically a culture of compliance in place, but what's missing is that documentation, as they treat as being non-compliant within practices. So with this webinar, our goal is to change practices' perspective on HIPAA, and rather than just looking at the big picture by focusing on keeping patients' information safe, we want your practice to change its mindset a little bit and look through it more as a auditor's lens, which looks like this. So it's really about each piece of the puzzle coming together to form your HIPAA compliance program, with one piece not being more important than the others, but without one piece being documented correctly, a practice cannot consider themselves HIPAA compliant to the government standards. And it's just about all these pieces coming together to form that full picture. Now, first things first, we're starting off with the security risk analysis. Now, this is going to be action step number 1 to take away from today. Some of you may completed it, some may not know what a risk analysis is, but the security risk analysis is a requirement for all covered entities under the HIPAA security rule. It's going to be the first step to assessing potential risks and vulnerabilities to protected health information held by the organization. So this is what auditors are going to ask for first in all situations. So it is essential that is documented. They're not going to come to your office and see how your day-to-day operations go. They are going to ask for proof of a risk analysis. Really, in layman's terms, this is just a self-evaluation of your practice within these three categories of safeguards. So the physical, the technical, and the administrative. They want you to evaluate the safeguards that you have in place, which is fairly easy to identify, but the problem lies within identifying those safeguards that you don't have in place. And that's where the government wants you to implement solutions to mitigate vulnerable areas. Now, for dental practices, it could be hard to know what safeguards you need and currently don't have, because if you knew about them, you probably would have already implemented a solution or at least a plan to implement them. But as either like an office manager, doctor, or even owner of the practice doing a million other things day to day, how are you supposed to know on your own what's considered best HIPAA practices for a dental provider? And that's just where it presents. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no. So Amber, I mean, I'm sure you both have been asked this quite frequently, but how often do you have to conduct a security risk analysis? And if so, how do you conduct one? I mean, where do you start and how often?
Yeah, happy to help there. Amber's going to touch on this in a few more slides, but it's recommended to be ongoing or at least once a year, right? The government wants you to identify risks in your SRA and then start to mitigate risks over time. So I think there's this misconception of like the government's going to come in and say, you've identified a bunch of risks. Now you have to spend a bunch of money and mitigate those risks. They want you to identify, document, show good faith effort, and then ultimately do it over time. And then obviously as things change with laws, with employment, your staff, what you do within your organization, there's going to be different risk levels. So again, it's really just a self-assessment that you should be doing on an ongoing basis. The government has actually identified, she'll show this here in a minute too, that only 14% of practices have actually completed a comprehensive security risk analysis, which is pretty concerning. I mean, it's a good opportunity for companies to come and assist with that, which I'm going to get to in a second. But they know that they need to hold practice accountable on conducting this SRA and ultimately mitigating risk over time. The second part of that question is how do you even get started? There is a free government tool. The problem with that government tool is it's not compatible on Apple products as of right now. And it kind of just gives you overall risk levels, and it doesn't really help you mitigate risk and kind of push you to do anything. It's just kind of a document, a static document at that point. Other ways to do it is go outside your organization, a third party, obviously consultants or a software like Abyde. We're kind of biased towards Abyde, but the point of this is do something, right? Get an SRA completed. And the last way to do it is to try to conduct it yourself. But as an office manager or practice owner trying to do a million different things, where do you even know where to begin? So that's where we kind of come in. But I hope this helps and really just kind of getting you guys to think about the SRA in a different way, like get it going and then good faith effort over time.
Yeah, it was a really great question. So there are two phases of compliance. The first being the risk analysis that we just covered. Just understand that the risk analysis is not the beginning nor the end of HIPAA compliance either. In fact, a lot of practices forget and even struggle with the second step as well, which is just ensuring that there's ongoing compliance efforts within your organization. So in the case of an audit, the government will want to see proof of how you're just mitigating that risk that's been identified in the risk analysis, as Chris was mentioning. But they just want to see how you can mitigate the risk just for your overall HIPAA compliance program for breaches. So it's really a combination of all these things coming together, and it's just an ongoing process. So first things first, risk mitigation. So the privacy rule says that you need to have an ongoing compliance program to help mitigate any risks you found in your risk analysis. Let's just say, for example, in your risk analysis that you've identified that some computers don't have like a business level antivirus software. The next steps are to be proactive about implementing a business level antivirus package just for all computers. And that's just one example of potentially hundreds, but gives you a little bit of an idea of what they're looking for risks to be mitigated and progress to be made. Next up, everyone's favorite topic, HIPAA training. I know it's probably not the, best thing to do each year, but you must ensure that there is HIPAA training for employees and doctors at minimum once per year. Best practices and even our recommendation is to conduct training in a modular type format, which requires there to be a quiz at the end of each training. We also recommend having new employees trained within 30 days of coming aboard as well. Next puzzle piece here is policies and procedures. Now, this is definitely a big one. So policies and procedures must be drafted specific to your practice, identifying how your organization addresses the security and the privacy of protected health information. And this is definitely very vital in case of an audit. If we swing back to that tax example, policies and procedures are equivalent to your supporting tax documentation, like 1099s, W-2s, receipts. So in the case of a tax audit, the IRS may want to see additional proof to that tax return. Same thing goes for your policies and procedures for your practice. In case of an audit, a HIPAA audit, if auditors go beyond your security risk analysis, they're going to want to see that documented policies and procedures that are specific to your practice. Now, we see a lot of practices go and purchase or maybe even download just generic templates, generic policies and procedures, and this was actually called out in the latest round of OCR audits as not meeting their requirements. And practices that didn't have specific policies to their day-to-day operations were found to be non-compliant in that aspect. The next piece here is a patient authorization and consent forms. So getting HIPAA authorization and consent forms signed is just another piece of your big HIPAA puzzle. And for the most part, we see many practices just doing a great job about handling this aspect, but there is a little bit of a disconnect. I know some practices or a lot of practices feel that just getting these signed makes them HIPAA compliant. It is important, yes, but it is just one piece of the bigger picture here. Next up is Hipaa Manual. So every organization must have a Hipaa Manual. And really, this is just an organized area for you to access your risk analysis, your policies and procedures, and any other HIPAA related documents as necessary. This can be physical that you can stick on, in a binder, obviously. You can have it on the shelf, or it can be electronic, whichever you prefer. We do recommend having at least one copy of your documents in electronic form, just so you can have access to that documentation in case there's some sort of a disaster like a fire or flood, and you won't lose all that and have to start from scratch. The next piece is business associate agreements. Now, this is definitely another really big point of emphasis for the OCR lately. All business associates must sign current agreements to prevent the practice from being liable in case of a breach on the vendor side. So just some examples of a business associate and who you'll need to have agreements signed with would be IT companies, consultants, even your EHR and practice management companies would need to have them signed, third-party billing companies, even telehealth companies. I know that's super popular now with COVID and everything, and even patient communication solutions like Weave or Solution Reach would need to have these agreements signed with your practice. So really the key takeaway when trying to determine if an organization or company even fits within this definition is if they perform certain functions or activities that involve the use or disclosure of protected health information on behalf of your practice or provides services to a covered entity. So if they have access or potential access to PHI, they would need to have this agreement signed. And protected health information can be something as indiscreet as like a phone number or even just a last name with a first initial. So we do have an example a little bit later in the presentation on how not having a BAA signed costs an organization $100,000. So it's super, super important to get signed. And then last but not least is your just updating security risk analysis. So this is definitely another area that we see create pain for the dental industry, is just constantly updating your security risk analysis. The government does want this updated and completed once a year. I know we kind of already touched on that, but it's every time you try to go and do that, it's like you're reinventing the wheel. It's the same amount of work year after year, but we do recommend keeping it updated on a continual basis. It'll minimize the amount of work you have to do overall. So if you're implementing new solutions, go ahead and update it on your risk analysis. Just showing that progress on your security risk analysis is definitely vital in case of investigation as well. So this is what any good HIPAA compliance program looks like. It's about all these pieces just coming together, working in unison to really create your culture of compliance for your practice. Now we're gonna just catch everyone up to speed if you're just now joining or you joined, mid-session. We've identified that the government is enforcing HIPAA compliance now more than ever. The government really hasn't been more active than they are now, and definitely don't expect that to change with the current administration. But we also laid out the path to compliance for your practice. So it's about all these pieces being documented correctly that'll save you from HIPAA fines overall. So missing one piece will put your practice at an incredibly high risk for HIPAA fines and audits. But really, sometimes the best way to learn is from others' mistakes. So we're going to go ahead and just go over the latest round of proactive HIPAA audits and some recent HIPAA fine examples as well. So these results are the enforcement data released December of 2020. They show that only 6% of covered entities actually implemented an appropriate ongoing risk management program. And that's a pretty staggering number when you actually think about how much patient data is actually out there, potentially unprotected without, the required HIPAA safeguards in place. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into these results, and it's important to think of these as the areas that the OCR sees as opportunities for enforcement as well. So they've already identified them as weak spots, but we'll definitely continue to enforce. They'll definitely continue to enforce fines when the practice does not meet requirements. So I'm going to touch on two of the results here. So first one is only 11% of the practices met patient right of access requirements. So not meeting these requirements, these practices did not meet the right time frame standards for providing records, or they just didn't provide the right type or format of the records requested. The second one is only 14% of covered entities have completed a security risk analysis. And by that, we mean an appropriate government standard meeting SRA. And this is definitely one of the most common issues that we see among practices as well. But the common themes here are just around patients, basic HIPAA requirements, and handling breaches correctly. And you can definitely bet that the OCR will continue with these areas in 2022.
Those are bad numbers.
So, bad numbers,
sorry,
I know, but
I gotta say it straight out. Oh my gosh,
she couldn't hold it back.
I couldn't hold it back anymore.
I know, but people who are on here today, you're taking a good step in the right direction if you haven't done so already, but it is pretty staggering, kind of scary a little bit.
Yes.
But really one specific area of focus for the OCR is patient right of access. And this was highlighted in the audit results that I just shared with you all. Over the last 2 years, the OCR was busy getting numerous access-related fines, including 5 fines in one day, twice, which is a record-breaking high. That's a good amount. In addition to settling 25 total right of access fines too. Recipients of the OCR included just practices that refused to provide or even delayed in providing patient records after requests were actually made by the patient or the patient's authorized personal representative. Some quick notes: the longest it took a practice to provide records was 36 months, and that's 3 whole years. And just to put that in a little bit more perspective, the government requirement is that records should be provided within 30 days. It does vary by state, but unfortunately it took this practice 3 years to give out their patient records. But the fines here and the variation in amounts can be pretty costly. They actually levied the smallest fine ever, which was $3,500, but even so, the average fine amount was more than $27,000, and the largest was about $200,000.
Wait, just make sure I heard you right. You
Right.
said that
Yes.
It's required to do it in 30 days, and someone took 3 years.
Someone took 3 whole years to give out patient records, and it does vary by state again, but provided within 30 days, of which it should be. So, not
So
sure
is
what
there like
happened
a
there,
fine
but
for every month that goes
Yeah, I was gonna ask.
by?
Yeah, there
they
is a
probably
fine.
have some sort of time frame on how they divvy up the fines. Chris, are you aware of anything?
Yeah, they just tier it, and again, we were talking about this earlier. It spurs the investigation, right? The other takeaway is they likely didn't have a security risk analysis, and if they did, they didn't have policy and procedures on what their employees should be doing when a patient requests their data. So that's another thing, training your employees and making sure you have specific documentation on what your state and federal law is on providing that data in a timely manner. Like out in California, it's a lot stricter than it is here in Florida. It's like 10 or 15 days. It's 30 days here in Florida. So yeah, that's where the education comes in. And
Yeah.
again, these are ranging from 3,500 to 200,000 at this point. The government's really trying to make a point of this, and we can quote them in saying, "We will literally make a point of this until you guys get the picture." So that's the point. The 21st Century Cures Act. There's so many different things we could talk about that have happened over the last year that we're happy to educate on. But really, the big message here is the government's watching, patients are watching, and it's time for practices to take HIPAA serious. Is really what the message is.
I just want everyone to know, next time Maria asks me to do anything, I'll say I'll get it back to you in 3 years.
I'll do it in 3 years.
Exactly.
You'll forget about it.
Don't
by
do
then,
it in
but
3 years.
I'll get it back to you
Yeah,
then.
but I'm glad that you brought this up, because looking from a practice myself, I don't think that we ever took the time frame because we get so busy. So it's important for everybody to know here on tonight's, event that you
30 days.
You got 30 days. Or whatever your state.
Super important. Yeah, whatever your
Unless
state.
unless you're in California
Yeah.
or New York.
Then we're sending Maria.
I think
after you.
they have like 10 days. It's so short for California and New York. So definitely important to stay up on those.
Take note, everybody.
But yes, the key takeaways here, just first, the patient right of access is just continuing to be a focus for the OCR enforcement recently, just particularly around providing patient records in the right time frame. Again, they find covered entities $85,000 to $165,000 just for taking way too long to provide records, and both were due to a single patient complaint. So these fines, again, just reinforce that they are going to continue to punish those who don't comply, and they are holding practices accountable so they don't drag their feet along the way. And the second takeaway here just highlights what many practices were missing, which is the importance of having policies in place on providing PHI access to patients with the required content. So if your staff knows how to correctly handle requests for access, and you have that documentation proof that your policies and procedures are in place to properly provide patient access to PHI, then you've severely limited the risk of receiving a HIPAA violation. Now, another really big trend for enforcement recently, which comes with the most costly fines, have revolved around cybersecurity missteps. So key things to note here is we've seen a record number of cyber-related breaches from those covered entities and business associates within the last couple of years. And I know that some of our own customers have had BAs affected through hacking and phishing events last year. So that's just why it's super essential to have those business associate agreements in place before any breach actually occurs. And super, super important to emphasize that these cyber-related events and fines, it wasn't necessarily the breach that caused the fine for practices. It's because the practice had no documented HIPAA program in place, and they were missing key HIPAA requirements just to protect their technology systems that really got them into trouble. So having a complete HIPAA program plays a huge part in cybersecurity. And lastly, fines related to cybersecurity included up to $1.04 million. So that's a hunk of change, and more likely for a smaller practice, $200,000, but that was given to a practice who didn't have proper employee termination procedures in place. So they had an employee gone rogue, unfortunately, and they were able to gain access to the public health clinic's database and stole some patient information of hundreds of patients after her login credentials were left active despite her termination. So
I'm
a little
sorry.
crazy there.
Yeah, but you know what though? I mean, I know that in
It
our audience,
happens.
yeah, it happens in our audience today. I think that our audience members need to be more cognizant. You think that, Jane was really nice and sweet and she or he couldn't do anything to you, or, but
They probably were really nice.
yeah, but the
Until
thing
you
is though,
fired them.
I know the thing is though, I think it's very important to notate that they should have an exit strategy or
Documentation.
process of like, taking away
It's
access to their practice
it's an
management stuff and other stuff. Go ahead.
it's an offboarding policy, right? Like, how do
Yes.
you offboard employees? During the pandemic, there was a bunch of furloughed employees. So what we did was we actually have a COVID-19 and HIPAA training that's still applicable today because there's so much remote work. You're offboarding your furloughing employees. So just making sure that you remove passwords and, have a list of who has keys to the office and who has access to your EHR, CareStack, what have you, right? So again, the point of this is like, it's all in good faith. Like the government, they do these things, they roll these things out because they know it could help save a ton of cost and stress. And honestly, the patient's data is so much more valuable than credit card information. And we know how serious we take credit card information, right? So that's the point, right? Have an offboarding strategy. Make sure that you have a list of who has passwords, who has username passwords, who has access to the software or to your physical location, and just be aware of that. There's plenty of examples that we go over, but again, we're not trying to scare anybody. We're trying to open your eyes to just understand that this is happening.
Right.
Like Amber said before, though, I'm pretty sure you said, learn from the mistakes of people from the past. Like, don't make the same mistakes that have already been made. Learn from them and don't make that one.
And don't do it.
Yeah.
So key takeaways from those slides is, again, what should you do to really not end up like these practices hit with massive fines? First, make sure you have all the basic technical safeguards in place. And that means having that security risk analysis data to know where your weaknesses lie. Then getting in touch with any qualified IT vendor if necessary to correct any red flags. Second here is to make sure that your asset log is up to date and make sure your data on all devices is encrypted. So really knowing where your data is stored and saved is essential to getting those devices protected. So highly recommend starting with that asset log to identify really what you have where, then enlisting IT support to get those devices squared away. And I know I mentioned that cybersecurity breaches were really at fault because of business associates getting hacked or infected with ransomware. Business associates do continue to find themselves victims, in turn that it can make your data more vulnerable and it can make your practice liable, just in addition to general liability if there's no agreement in place at all. So really, as far as BAs go, the most important things to note here, record fines have been levied towards business associates, and not having that required business associate agreement in place makes your practice just as liable, even if the breach has nothing to do with you. I know business associates like EHR companies, data hosting centers are typically the biggest targets for cyber attacks too. So it's super essential to have those agreements signed with each if you haven't done so already. Great example is shown here where a provider was slapped with a $100,000 fine after the provider filed a breach complaint with their own EHR company who refused to provide them with patient records. So even though the provider filed that complaint, when the OCR investigated, they found that the practice was actually at fault because they didn't have a business associate agreement in place. They didn't have a risk analysis or any of the just necessary safeguards. They didn't even implement it after the breach was filed. So also important to note is just that in this example, it did happen to a 3,000 patient practice. So it wasn't like a large healthcare system or a physician's group. It can be, small practices that we even go to as patients. So it can really happen to anyone. But last thing here, just to drive it home a little bit, your vendors should have the same safeguards in place as you do if they work with PHI on behalf of the practice. So it's very, very key to protecting your own patients, and it's super essential just to make sure that you don't wind up like these practices here and get hit with a massive fine. Now, Two takeaways from the business associate agreements is get those agreements signed now. Can't stress that enough. If you don't have them signed, highly recommend getting that done as soon as possible, but also recommend getting these just a part of future contract paperwork with any new vendors that you may take on in the future. And then second is just make sure all vendors you work with do have the appropriate safeguards in place. So again, business associates are a prime target for cyber attacks and enforcement this year. Your practice definitely does not want to get caught in those crosshairs. So getting those agreements signed is just a huge first step, and just making sure you only work with qualified vendors as well will protect your practice and your patients.
So we actually do have some questions around this from some of our clients. Thank you, Penny.
Perfect.
So one, do all employees need an BAA agreement in place? And the second, what if someone refuses to sign one?
So good question. The first one, employees, have them sign an employee confidentiality agreement. They work for your practice, your organization. They're part of your organization. You have to train them, but you also have an employee confidentiality agreement in place with them. Huge. Okay. Don't think of your employees as a business associate. Don't think of your other doctors, other colleagues, anybody that is a covered entity as a business associate. They are covered entities. They're covered under HIPAA. Business associates are not covered under HIPAA, but they are required to do the same things that Amber just mentioned, right? And if a covered entity refuses to sign your business associate agreement, do you want to really do business with that vendor? Is the question, right? Now, if they just refuse and they just want you to sign yours, if they just want you to sign theirs, just make sure you review it and it's going to appropriately cover the practice, your practice, right? So there's certain things in that language. Make sure it's not super general, but if and when there's a data breach on their end, that it's a mutually signed contract. That way it offsets liability in the case of that breach. I hope that makes sense, but employee confidentiality agreement, that's for your employees, and then business associate agreements is for a third-party vendor that has potential or direct access to your data.
Okay, thank you. That's actually really helpful.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, and those are some great questions. Keep them coming if you have any more. And now we're just going to dive into some HIPAA audit processes, just some audit letters that we've went over with our customers and that we assisted them with. So just to give you a little peek behind the curtains of what that process could look like. So the first example I'm going to touch on is from an eye care practice. They did have a laptop stolen at one of their practices, which subsequently triggered an OCR HIPAA audit. We did walk them through that entire process, and since they were already a customer, they did have that documentation in place to prove that they were HIPAA compliant. But you can see on your screen that we did get word back from the OCR closing their investigation, no corrective action plan needed, and more importantly, no financial penalties levied against the practice either, which is great. And then the next example is from 2020. You can see on the audit letter that they received from their state attorney general that after they had a data breach. So the interesting part of this audit is that the information that was breached wasn't social security numbers or even names. It was actually only email addresses. But when it comes to HIPAA, email addresses are considered protected health information. So when the office manager accidentally carbon copied in 400 other patients rather than just blind copying, they did experience a HIPAA breach. Another interesting fact about this audit is just take a look at all the information that the state is actually asking the practice to provide, just all because of an email breach. I know we were surprised when we saw it too, that they were so detailed with their requests, but it just goes to show that, without having a comprehensive HIPAA compliance program in place, which again, it means it needs to be documented correctly, this practice would have fallen victim to a massive HIPAA fine or any other corrective action measures that they were going to give. But big takeaway here for both of these situations is that these practices decided to act before an incident occurred. So not only did they act, but they realized going outside of their organization for assistance with HIPAA compliance was the best decision that they could have made for their practice. And I'm sure that after going through this process, it's a decision that they did not regret. But really, just in summary here, these are some questions just to ask yourself and your practice going forward to make sure you're complying with HIPAA. So if you've completed a security risk analysis, how are you going to continue to update it, ongoing compliance program, just preparing for audits, and being efficient with your time. And then the last question is obviously the biggest of them all. If any of these three things were to happen tomorrow, because no one's immune to a data breach, an audit, or a patient complaint, do you feel comfortable with that documentation you do or you don't have? Now, if you're questioning your current compliance program or maybe have some questions that are hard to answer, that that's where we can come in the
Thank you guys so much for being here. We really appreciate it, and we genuinely are looking forward to the OSHA one, hopefully in Q2, Q3 of this year.
Yes.
Yeah, no, we're excited. Thanks again for the opportunity. You guys were amazing hosts, and it's been great. Thank you, everybody. Seriously, it's awesome.
All right. Yeah. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right.